In the election of 1800, for the first time, you're going to have Federalists and Republicans meeting in a certain place to decide who their presidential and vice presidential candidates are going to be. Okay? And what that means is now we call them conventions. Republican National Convention, Democratic National Convention. In those days, they called them caucuses. Okay? And so they would meet in their caucuses, the Federalist Caucus and the Republican Caucus, and they would pick a vice president and a presidential candidate. And so it's the first time we see what we know as a semblance of conventions like we see today, where they send delegates to do this. So instead of just meeting or trying to have 3 or 4 people do the whole job, they met as an entire party in certain places and picked these candidates. Now, the Federalists chose President Adams to run for a second term, but they went with a different vice presidential candidate. They picked Charles C. Pinckney. Charles C. Pinckney. Now, the Republicans didn't change at all. They again chose Thomas Jefferson as their candidate for president and Aaron Burr for vice president. Now remember, they made the unwritten rule here that you were to vote for the same party for president and vice president, right? So we didn't have the problem we did in 1796, where you end up with a president of one political party and a vice president of the other. And people obeyed that unwritten law very well in this election. So when the election results were tabulated, another weird thing, Thomas Jefferson, because we still have the same rule, right? First vote getter, second vote getter. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied with 73 electoral votes each. We got a tie now. So these elections are just getting a little bit weirder. So who's the president, who's the vice president, Naya? We don't know. Now, the rule then and the rule today is if there is a tie, and I'll explain what the rule today is in a minute, then the House of Representatives will decide the presidency. In today's election, the election of 2017, some people predicted that neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump would get the number of electoral votes they needed to win, because you have to have 2/3, right? So what happens in a presidential election today if neither candidate reaches the magic number of electoral votes? It goes to the House of Representatives and they decide, with the advantage, obviously, to the party that controls the House, right? So in this particular case, who controlled the House of Representatives in 2017? Huh? Democrats. Okay? So if that would have went to the House, who would have had the advantage? Hillary Clinton. Okay? So in this particular election, who controls the House? In this election, it's the Federalists, right? The problem is you've got 2 Republicans they're trying to pick from. So obviously, these members of the House don't see either candidate as the answer, but unfortunately, they're going to have to pick. Now, as they get in and start talking about which one of these men they're going to pick and vote upon, at first, and during most of this discussion, the Federalists in Congress preferred Aaron Burr. That was their choice. Now, have you ever heard of President Aaron Burr? Well, no, so that tells you that something happened, right? Well, somebody stepped in and used his influence to convince the House to elect Jefferson. Who do you think stepped in?
Alexander.
Absolutely. That's exactly right, Jaden. Alexander Hamilton stepped in and said, hey, let's not go for Aaron Burr, let's go for Thomas Jefferson. Because Hamilton viewed Jefferson, listen to this, as the lesser of 2 evils.
That was used this election.
Yeah, lesser of 2 evils. He believed that Thomas Jefferson would be the lesser of 2 evils. He didn't want either one of these guys. But he thought the country would be better off and the Federalist Party would be better off if Jefferson was president. So Hamilton uses his influence, and when the votes come out, Jefferson receives 10 votes from the House. Burr gets 4, and 2 members of the House made the decision they weren't even going to vote. They were so disgusted. So, as a virtue of this going to the House of Representatives, Thomas Jefferson becomes the nation's 3rd president, and Aaron Burr assumes the role, as he had before, of vice president. Okay? Now, this just caused a ton of confusion. Because what's happening? They're not voting on separate ballots, are they, for president and vice president? That's caused trouble in both elections. So because of this confusion in the election of 1796 and in 1800, they passed the 12th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the 12th Amendment of the United States Constitution stated that from this point on, voters will vote on separate ballots for the office of president and vice president. So you're either going to run for president or you're going to run for vice president. You can't throw your name in the hat and hope you're one of the top 2 vote getters. You're going to be designated. Okay? Now, Jefferson was pretty excited when he won the presidency, because guess who gained control of Congress in this election? The Republicans. So we're going to have a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican president. That is good if you're the president. You get a lot more done. Okay? So that is the election of 1800. And that'll take us to our last subtopic of this test material, which will be final actions by President Adams. This is kind of an interesting story. Final actions by President Adams. Now, you guys understand that there was a period of time between the time Donald Trump was elected president in early November and when he was inaugurated in January. And during that time, President Obama had full power of the presidency. They call that a lame duck presidency, and normally they don't do too much those last 3 months. For example, when I took over the principalship, and I was here 3 years, and then I left the principalship, and Mr. Smith took the principalship, when it was announced at Christmas that I was going to go back to council and he was going to be the principal, do you think I spent the next 6 months changing all kinds of things and doing all kinds of things? No, because I didn't want him to. I want him to inherit his thing, not mine. You know what I mean? You know, if I went in there and all of a sudden hired a bunch of teachers that I liked and maybe he wouldn't like, he would have to deal with those teachers that he didn't like. Well, this is kind of what John Adams did, because there were 4 months between the time Jefferson was elected and he took office. And during that time, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. So, during that 4 months between the time that Jefferson was elected and took office, Adams still ran the country. And during that time, on purpose, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. We've already had one, right? 1789. And what did that one do in 1789? It provided 13 district courts, 3 circuit courts, and a Supreme Court. And it placed judges in each of those areas, right? Well, what this Judiciary Act of 1801 did is it added 16 more judges to those 3 sectors of court. So between the district, circuit, and Supreme Court, they were going to add 16 more judges. Now, where am I going on this? Think about, where am I going on this? Why is this talked about? Why does anybody care? Who's picking these 16 judges? The President of the United States, who's Federalist, right? And you know what type of judges he's going to pick. Is he going to pick Republican judges? No. It'd be just like if I left the principalship and hired teachers that Mr. Smith didn't like or didn't want because they didn't have his philosophy. That's kind of a backdoor way of doing things. And I'm telling you, Adams did this. He picked all 16, and it took him till midnight of his last day in office to fill the final 16th position. So those appointments that he made as judges to our court system, because he finished some at midnight of his last day, go down in history as the midnight appointments. They were done just before he left office, and what can Thomas Jefferson do about it? Not a thing. Okay, so that was an interesting thing that was done. Now, did Adams make good choices on all of his justices? No, but he did make one really good choice, and that's when he chose John Marshall, and then appointed John Marshall to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, replacing John Jay. That a girl. So, the most significant appointment that was made by President Adams during these midnight appointments was when he appointed Judge John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That was a good move. That was a good move. Tell you a little bit about him. Do you have him?
Yes.
How long did he serve on the Supreme Court?
Ooh,
Approximately.
a long time. I don't have an exact.
Well, just give me a guess. 10,
10,
20, 30, 40? Huh?
40 years.
Pretty close. 34 years he served on the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice. That's a long time. From 1801 to 1835. He served 34 years as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's a long tenure. And he was involved in over 500 Supreme Court decisions during that 34-year period of time. He was an exceptional Supreme Court Justice, and John Marshall still remains one of the most highly regarded, if not the best, Supreme Court Justice we ever had in American history. So that was a good choice. That was a very good choice. Okay? Anybody have any questions on this? All right, we're going to go away from something now, and we're going to introduce you to your writing books here. Okay? Now, just so you know, we're going to have a review on Monday and a test on Tuesday.